What's up, Wizards? It's Dev. Somehow lost the SD card after recording today's video. I don't know where it is. It's got to be somewhere between my office and my living room, so a pretty small area to cover, but it could be anywhere. Who knows? Either way, that means this is today's intro for day 4 of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. That's right, it's Friday spoilers for today, and we got some really good stuff. Now, there is some whatever kind of stuff, as usual, but honestly, we get into some pretty powerful commons and uncommons very quickly here, and pretty much every rare today is worth talking about in the context of like standard competitive constructed. So let's go ahead and get to it. Let's open things up today by looking at Agency, Coroner, Clandestine Meddler, and Due Diligence. Now, Coroner is just 5 mana, 4 and a black for a 3/6 Ogre Cleric. You can pay 2 and a black and sack another creature to draw a card. If the sacrificed creature was suspected, you draw 2 cards instead. I like sacrificing guys and drawing cards. I especially like drawing multiple cards. It's all cool, but this whole package is more expensive than a Five Guys hamburger, so I'm not too sure that I'm that interested in it, and I hate that it can't sacrifice itself. That's lame. So we'll move on to Clandestine Meddler. 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 3/2 Vampire Rogue. When it ETBs, suspect up to 1 other target creature you control. Whenever 1 or more suspected creatures you control attack, surveil 1. Why can't this target itself? Why isn't it whenever a suspected creature you control attacks? It's 1 or more, so it's ever only going to trigger once. So like, it's just all so lame. But I guess in limited it seems kind of somewhat fine, but that's about it. As far as Due Diligence goes, this is 3 mana, 2 and a white for an aura that enchants a creature. When Due Diligence enters the battlefield, target creature you control other than enchanted creature, again for some reason, gets +2/+2 and gains vigilance until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has vigilance. Nothing really special about, honestly, any of these cards, so let's go ahead and move on so we can get to some good stuff. Let's briefly check out Seasoned Consultant, Repeat Offender, and Innocent Bystander next here. Some of these are pretty great names. Now, Consultant is 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 1/3 human detective. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, Seasoned Consultant gets +2/+0 till end of turn. See, this includes itself in its own math, which I kind of like. We haven't seen that yet today for some annoying reason, but either way, only 2 other dudes have to attack with this for it to be a Watch Wolf, 2 mana, 3/3, and I'm kind of okay with that, especially in like aggressive limited decks. It seems pretty decent. Now, Repeat Offender is also 2 mana, 1 and a black this time for a 2/1 human assassin with the activated ability 2 and a black. If Repeat Offender is suspected, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Otherwise, suspected. So most of the time, the first time you activate this, okay, it's suspected, so I guess it has menace now. Also can't block, which is kind of lame, but it has menace. And then the second time you suspect it, it becomes a 3/2. You have put 8 mana into the card at that point. It's probably not super great, but I guess limited mana things like this are always okay. But Innocent Bystander is actually pretty interesting. This is 2 mana, that's, well, I guess, 1 and a red for a 2/1 Goblin Citizen. And whenever it's dealt 3 or more damage, you investigate. That's kind of neat in a way. If it was just when it dies, investigate, that would obviously be way better and probably just like almost standard playable in some ways. But as it stands in limited, I like that. Let's say this blocks a face down creature. Well, if they just trade with each other, nothing really happens other than you got the face down guy off the other side of the table, which is fine. But if they flip up and like blow you out somehow and like they don't lose their guy, but you lose your goblin here, at least you investigate. Like, it gives you something for getting blown out. And I think that's kind of neat. Let's step up the limited power level a little bit and look at Rakish Scoundrel and Greenbelt Orator next. Now, Scoundrel is 4 mana, 2, a black and a green for a 3/3 elf rogue with Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield or its turn face up, target creature gains indestructible until end of turn, and it disguises for 4 and 2 Golgari hybrids. So 6 mana is an awful lot to flip this up, but once you do, indestructible and Death Touch is a pretty nice combination, and obviously you can do other tricks besides just that. It doesn't have to give itself indestructible, not at all. So you can save your bomb with this if some weird thing goes wrong in combat. Again, costs an awful lot of mana to do that, but I imagine you'll play this a good amount of the time. A Greenbelt Order might be kind of important for limited because this looks like the way they've decided to work in an overrun effect this time around. This is 4 mana, 3 and a green for a 4/4 Centaur Citizen. It's got Disguise 5 and 2 green. That's so much mana. But when it's turn face up, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. They gain trample until end of turn. Again, just a way for green decks and limited to make sure they can break through if they get to a certain point of the game. There's one of these in nearly every limited environment, and this looks like a cool one, especially considering if you don't think you're going to get to 7 mana, or maybe you need a fat guy right now. It's a 4 mana 4/4, and there's really nothing bad about that to begin with. But before we get to the truly interesting / powerful uncommons from the day, let's look at some really weird ones next. This is Essence of Antiquity and Pompous Braggart up next. Now, Essence is 5 mana, 3 and 2 white for a 1/10 artifact creature that's a golem. It's got Disguise 2 and a white. When Essence of Antiquity is turned face up, creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn, and you get to untap them. I guess the only truly weird thing about this is the 110 stat line, although I imagine Arcades the Strategist players probably love this in Commander, and us standard players, you know, we just saw that like turtle elk thing yesterday. I think it's another thing. I think it's 3 things and I've forgotten one of them, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Either way, you can activate that guy, and when a creature gets through for combat damage, it will draw cards equal to its toughness. So, like, that guy can draw 15 cards, right? But this dude can draw 10 cards if you have that guy in play. It's a kind of neat thing for them to, I guess, enable at pre-releases. If you do that, you're going to have the time of your life, right? But either way, just the stat line is weird. Everything else in the card is kind of neat. Again, especially in Limited, where this can flip up and do a cool thing. But in Standard, you know, I don't really want to pay 6 mana for my protection spells. I want to pay 1 mana for my protection spells. So, you know, I don't want to skip a turn on turn 3 to put this on the table in the first place, and then just hold up mana for the rest of the game until I can activate the Disguise. Nah, it's just, I'll pass on that. But in Limited, it's kind of cool. Now, Pompous Braggart over here is a really cool way to use the design space as flavorfully as possible. This is 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 4/2 human citizen. As long as it's your turn, this guy has hexproof, and he can't ever be blocked by creatures without a name. Really love that flavor. Who are you? Who are you? You're nobody. Get out of my way. It just doesn't care. That's just perfect. Pitch perfect flavor on this. And I like the way, again, that they're using the sort of design space of face down guys. So really, really cool, but not actually that much to write home about, I guess. You know, I guess the hexproof on your turn is really neat, but this guy is far from a Bogle, if anybody understands that reference in 2024. I don't think that he's going to be in like the green-white enchantments deck anytime soon, I guess is what I'm saying. Now, the next uncommon I want to look at isn't necessarily good, but I didn't know where to stick it because it's kind of interesting. So I'll just look at it by itself. It's Polygraph Orb. This is 5 mana, 4 and a black for an artifact. That's so much. Now, when it ETBs, you're going to look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, the rest into your yard, you lose 2 life. You can pay 2 and tap this and collect evidence 3. And each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card or sacrifice a creature. So kind of a Turgrid's Lantern-y sort of thing once you get it into play, and it's actually like a fair amount of pressure once you can start activating it, but you're not going to be activating it all the time. I hate that you have to collect evidence, but you only have to collect evidence 3. So that means you might be able to do this 3-4 times in a game, like fairly reliably once it comes down, and it does something when it enters the battlefield. It replaces itself in your hand twice and gives you a 4-card dig. The problem is that it's 5 mana. I may have mentioned that a second ago. 5 mana is way too much, I think, for like standard viability for a card like this, but it's really interesting design. And again, I like the card that it reminds me of an awful lot. So I wanted to give it a little special spotlight here, but I don't think it actually ends up doing that much. That said, really, really cool card. And I like cool cards. That's why I play Magic. You can check the orb, man. I'm not lying to you. So let's move on to some actually powerful commons and uncommons up next. This is where we start getting into some really good stuff, like Pick Your Poison, Get a Leg Up, and Mistway Spy. Now, Pick Your Poison might be the best card on screen. It's a single green mana for a sorcery. Choose 1. First mode, each opponent sacks an artifact. Second mode, each opponent sacks an enchantment. Third mode, each opponent sacks a creature with flying. That's really good for 1 mana. Just a single mana. You can main deck this in Limited, maybe, probably. There's a lot of artifacts in this set, so like probably. So I don't know, just a very, very cool card for just a single mana. That does give your opponent a little bit of choice because of the sack effect, but a green modal edict that hits 3 things for a single mana, like, sign me up for that. Sounds great. Now, Get a Leg Up I like because it's basically a strictly better Might of the Masses, and like I didn't think they would ever do that. By the way, I said the thing. It's a single green mana for an instant. Until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control. And gains reach. You see what they did? Just a tiny little dollop of whipped cream on top of Might of the Masses. But in Limited, that's probably going to make a pretty big difference. But Mistway Spy, this is actually really interesting. Just a single blue mana for a 1/1 Merfolk Detective with flying. It's a flying man, but it does so much more than a flying man. It's got Disguise, 1 and a blue. Now, when it's turned face up, until end of turn, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, Investigate. This could have so easily been whenever one or more creatures do the thing, you only get one clue, who cares? But no, in this case, for only 2 mana on the face up, you can draw like 3 cards. I know you're not drawing the cards, you're just investigating, but there's plenty of ways you can leverage that to your advantage. You know, there's lots of cards that care about artifacts coming into play. There's a bunch of cards that care about you popping clues, and not just because you get to draw a card, but because they care that you sacked a clue. There's a few in this set alone, so really neat that it can make like 2, 3, sometimes 4 clues for you and put you way ahead, especially if you're already getting in with like 3 creatures. You're probably doing great in that game of Magic, so you're just winning more at that point. I don't know, I really like this dude. I don't think he's super standard playable. I've said it before, and I'll probably say it a few more times this spoiler season. I think that if you're like spending 3 mana on your turn 3 in standard to face down a dude, you're probably falling behind, like almost certainly in that situation. So I'm just not sure that any of these disguise dudes are really that great in standard, but if there's one that looks close to pushed enough, it's this guy. We'll look at Case of the Burning Masks next. This is 3 mana, 1 and 2 red for an enchantment that is a case. When this case ETBs, it deals 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. To solve this case, 3 or more sources you control have to have dealt damage this turn. Now when you've solved the case, you sacrifice it and exile the top 3 cards of your library. Choose one of them. You may play that card this turn. A removal spell that easily draws a card in mono red. Seems pretty good, but it does cost 3 mana, and it's like really limited in what you want to do. I'm pretty sure mono red most of the time just wants to like add a haste body to the board, like a Godric or something like that on turn 3. I'm basically just saying that you'll have to basically skip turn 3 in mono red to play this. And even if it pays you back a card later, I think you'd rather just win now. But let's move on to a couple of my favorite cards of the whole day. Uncommon, rare, mythic, doesn't matter. I love these cards. We're going to look at Aftermath Analyst. Really excited about this one, as well as Chalk Outline, neat card here. But Analyst is 2 mana, 1 and a green for a 1/3 elf detective. When it ETBs, mill 3 cards. You can also pay 3 and a green and sacrifice it to Splendid Reclamation. Return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. That's nuts. That's nuts, dude. It is a whole 6 mana if you want a Splendid Reclamation the turn that you play it, which is a lot, you know. It's kind of a lot of mana all at once, but maybe you draw it off the top of your library. You don't care in the late game. You'll just pay that, but still, if you just play it on turn 2, you get to mill yourself a little bit, ensuring that maybe there will be a land or 2 in your yard when you do pop this off. And when you do, it's kind of really good ramp, you know? Like if you're able to put, say, some fetch lands of some kind in your yard somehow, and then pop this off, it basically guarantees like at 2 ramp if you did things correctly, but it could be more ramp even than that for just the 4 mana. So I really like this. It obviously goes in kind of the stick fingers, cruel somnophage, like green black deck. That deck needed another strong 2-drop, and honestly, it's definitely got that here. You can use this to ramp you, and then that'll help you cast like a larger stick fingers in the later game. So a lot of very cool stuff about this in that one specific deck, but I think it works outside of that deck too. So basically anything that's self-milling, or again, anything with fetch lands might want a card like this, because you're basically just casting Splendid Reclamation on a cheap body that also has an ETB trigger. Just really, really amazing card here, I think. Also just want to point out the ability to activate this card at instant speed. It doesn't say only as a sorcery or anything. You'd think that they would make it less fun by doing that, but they didn't. They didn't slap that on there. You just activate it any old time you want, which is pretty nuts, man. But let's look at Chalk Outline next. This is a fun card, and it may be better than just a fun card. This is 4 mana, 3 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, then investigate. This is neat, man. It's a little too much. I mean, 4 mana is not like super expensive, but it's starting to get a little bit ritzy at that price, you know. But that said, a guy and a clue token? Like, the guy would almost be good enough by itself, but you're telling me I get to investigate too whenever a dude leaves my yard for any reason. You can unearth the guy, you can disturb the guy. There are multiple mechanics in standard right now that can work pretty well with a card like this. So that's awesome. You know, if I exile a dude from my graveyard with like Graveyard Trespasser, if my opponent does that, if it happens with Lord Skitter or any of the things that are just like one and done, remove a thing from a graveyard, right? There's a ton of cards, dozens of cards in standard, Urborg Scavengers, it feels like, that do that right now. So even if you're just doing it, you know, yeah, come on. Yeah, it's a really neat card, man. Like, it's a kind of expensive. I mean, 4 mana is not like too much, but it is getting towards the ritzy end of things for an effect like this. But once it is on the table, can pop off pretty easily. It's whenever a dude leaves your yard for any reason. And honestly, if it just gave you a 2/2, that would almost be good enough by itself. But no, it gives you a clue token too, which is just kind of absurd. It's a little bit bananas that the card does both of these things whenever a dude leaves your yard for any reason. You can unearth a guy, you can disturb a guy. There's multiple mechanics in standard, work pretty well with this card right now, right? There's stuff like Graveyard Trespasser and multiple, literally like a dozen or more other cards that are a lot like it, that just like one by one, remove cards from graveyards. So you can do it with stuff like that. And there's a lot of other ways, man, to get, you can reanimate stuff. There's, not only reanimator spells, but there are sort of creatures that can reanimate themselves or put themselves back in your hand. There's a bunch of spells that put things from your graveyard back into your hand for relatively cheap if they don't just reanimate the creature in the first place. So, you know what I'm trying to say? If we really sat here and looked through all the ways that dudes could leave your graveyard, we'd kind of be here all day, because that can happen for a lot of different reasons and just standard alone. So I could see this putting a bunch of bodies on the table, and maybe even more importantly, a bunch of clues. If they do end up wrathing you or somehow, containing your board state or getting rid of this, then maybe it replaced itself like 3, 4, 5 times before they could actually get rid of it. You're just sitting on a dragon's hoard of clues, and what are they going to do about that if you have the mana to pop them? So I don't know, man. I actually think there might be something to this despite the high price tag. It could still really go off if you do things right. Now, we've only got a couple of more uncommons to push through today, but they're both pretty good looking, man, especially the last one. But I do want to talk about Covad Honch real quick before we get to what I think is the best uncommon of the day. But this one I think is kind of low-key, like subtly good. So let's talk about it. Just a single white mana for an artifact. It is a food equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0. You can pay 2 and tap it and sack it to gain 3 life. You can also equip it for 2 mana. But here's the cool part. When it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a white. If you do, create 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens. Now, this does put a total of 5 mana in your cart by the time it's all said and done. You can pay it in installments, but it still ends up being a lot of mana for 3 life and 2 guys. But in the meantime, you can play this as early as turn 1, and then you've got an artifact for bargain, you've got an artifact for craft, you've got a cheap artifact that you can, throw into play and get value off of in your artifact deck, or maybe an artifact that counts towards Michiko's Reign of Truth, or Patchwork Automaton gets a +1/+1 counter because of this cheap artifact, and then you can equip it to your Patchwork Automaton. So that's a nice little thing for Patchy. I like that you can pick it up and just start swinging it around. That's a cool little function of the card. But aside from that, as around turn 4, something like that, you can just sack this, gain 3, put 2 guys into play, and that's actually pretty good. If you don't want to do that, you can just wait and then craft it with like a clay-fired bricks later in the game in your mono-white artifact deck with like Thousand Moon Smithy. Like, this is a really, really sweet card. But the best uncommon of the day is a counterspell. Deja Vu, man. The best uncommon the other day was the Azorius mana leak that they decided it was okay to print. This time, it's a Simic counterspell called Repulsive Mutation. This is a blue and a green and X for an instant. Put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. You remember that, like, Dimir 2 mana 8/8 from the last set? Just throw that in there, and then they have to just a straight up counter spell for only a couple of mana. But obviously Simic decks, and again Soul Tie and stuff like that, Bant even, probably have some bodies on the table. Again, especially if you're Bant, you're playing like Wandering Emperor and Wedding Announcement, like tokeny stuff like that, then you've got bodies around 4 days and at instant speed in the mid or late game, putting like 2 or 3 +1/+1 counters on a thing and countering a spell almost every time is going to be pretty freaking phenomenal, and you don't even necessarily have to have a relatively big body on the table in order to make this a decent counter spell. If it's just like if you have a 2/2, it's a make disappear. If you have a 3/3, it's a mana leak. If you have a 4/4, it's really good. So it's a card that hasn't been printed at 2 mana yet. So I like that, but obviously it scales up all the way into the late game, at which point there's going to be some nutso plays available where you counter your opponent's big, huge spell and also put 4 +1/+1 counters on one of your guys. So that just seems pretty ridiculous if you can pull it off that way. But you don't have to play in the late game. It's a fine spell in the early game so long as you have a body on the table, which is going to be the thing counter magic players aren't going to really like about having to like trying to make this card work some of the time, but in the right deck, and I don't think it's too hard to build the right deck and make it powerful. Again, that Bant deck I was talking about sounds halfway decent. A card like this could actually be incredible for not only countering them big plays, but closing out games. Card truly is repulsive, but for our first rare of the day, let's look at another Simic card. Why not? This one is probably worse, honestly, than the card we just looked at, but I think some Simic Commander players are going to go nuts for Doppelgang here. This is a green, a blue, and then triple X. Triple, YouTube, don't demonetize me. It's three times X, XXX, blue-green for a sorcery. For each of X target permanents, create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. So go nuts. Just Simic Ramp and Commander, you Johnny players out there that have all kinds of crazy ideas. This one's for you, baby, but it does cost too much mana. It just costs way too much. It costs 5 mana to copy one thing, if I'm not mistaken, 8 mana to copy another thing, which we're starting to get to 11 mana to copy 3 things, but this is Commander that we're talking about. So if you want to get that, 17 mana that's required to copy, what is that, like 5 things? Is that right? Yeah, 5 things for, yes, I think that's correct. for 17 mana. You can probably pull that off in Commander. I mean, don't you basically have infinite mana starting on turn 5 or something like that? So I don't think it's going to be that hard. And I guess even in Standard, there is the Simic Cauldron deck with Agatha's Soul Cauldron that not effectively, just does make infinite mana. So I guess if you haven't already won the game or you need a way to win the game, then Doppelgang, create an infinite number of the creatures you already control, is probably at least okay. But up next, we got to look at Barb, everybody. This is 4 mana, 3 and a black for a 1/1 artifact creature construct with indestructible. When it enters the battlefield, suspect it. It has menace and can't block. Whenever Barb's Servitor deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Whenever Barb's Servitor is dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life. Okay, so it's like a Brash Taunter at a discount, a card I really liked, but the problem is, it doesn't have that sweet activated ability where it can fight stuff. That was awesome. It was really fun, but also it can't block, which is just really lame. It's not going to hold off a 7/7 because your opponent doesn't want to take 7 to your Brash Taunter's blocking, So this doesn't quite work the way I want it to. Why can't you block with it? But still, your opponent is going to have to devote 2 things to blocking it if they don't want you to draw the card. And then those 2 things are going to hit it. So I imagine your opponent is probably going to just let you draw the card most of the time rather than take at least 2 damage, if not more. And of course, if there's ways you have of dealing damage to it, then that's fine too. You want to burn down the house while this is in play? Probably a halfway decent idea. Now, as much as I want to freak out about this dude for like the next 5 minutes, I actually really, really like this card, like a lot. I'm excited to play it, even though I don't think it's like that great, but anything that's even sort of comparable to Toski is a card we probably need to talk about. But there's so many good cards after this and that are all like actually worth like really talking about and constructed that we've got to move on. So let's talk about an Is It Vehicle? Is it Vehicle? In fact, it is. Let's talk about Kylock's something. This is Kylock's Volt Charger. I knew that's what it was called. Why didn't I just go with my instincts? Come on, Deb. It's 3 mana, 1 a blue and a red for a 4/4 vehicle. And you can collect Evidence 6 to have it become an artifact creature until end of turn. Or you can just crew it for 2. But here's the deal. Whenever Kylock's Volt Charger attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among cards you exiled with it. If a spell cast this way would be put into your graveyard, put it on the bottom of your library instead. Pretty cute that it puts it on the bottom of your library, but it couldn't just exile it again because then Volt Charger would have exiled it and you could just cast it again. You see how they had to get around that by putting it on the bottom of your library? Very neat, but this is just a 3 mana 4/4 vehicle guy that you just crew for 2. So that's just kind of a pretty decent baseline, just in and of itself. And then mid to late in the game, if you ever actually get the chance to even have this go off a single time, it can do some pretty rude stuff. So I would not count this card out of contention. I don't think it's like a Reckless Bankbuster or Reckoner. That's what it was. Reckoner Bankbuster. How quickly we forget. I don't think it's quite on that power level or anything, but I will say halfway decent stats at a baseline and then like ludicrous power at the ceiling. And then like in the middle between the floor and the ceiling here, you've actually got a lot of pretty good stuff you can do too. So I don't hate this. But let's move on to Case of the Locked Hothouse up next. This is 3 and a green for an enchantment, which is a case. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. To solve the case, you have to control 7 or more lands. Once it's solved, you may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may play lands and cast creature and enchantment spells from the top of your library. My goodness, the solved mode on this, like once you get it to that point, which only requires that you have 7 lands. We have a 7 lands deck in standard at this point. It's like Topiary Stomper, Twists and Turns, and this. So neat deck, but still, 7 lands is not that hard to get to. We've seen that in standard, and once you do that with this card in play, you don't even really have to do anything else. You don't have to do anything else. You just have it solved. You don't have to pay any mana or anything like that, and suddenly you can cast 3 different card types. Well, cast 2 different and play another different card type off the top of your library. That's nuts. I mean, most of your deck could just be that, right? Most of your deck could just be all 3 of those card types and not a whole lot else. So basically this just says play the cards off the top of your library. It's just absolutely bonkers once you actually get it off. And it's, again, not that hard to get off. Go. If anything, I mean, I'm talking about standard here. Like, I think there might be some standard playability on this card because, like, once it's solved, it's incredible card advantage for green. But in Commander, once we go to EDH, and I think this is probably just like an evergreen card. Just pardon the pun there. Well, don't pardon the pun. Hold me accountable. But still, I think that in green Commander decks, this is just going to be like a pretty sought after card for ever. Am I wrong? Call me out, Green Commander players, if you don't want to play this, but I'm pretty sure you do. Even if you think you don't, I'm pretty sure you actually do. I think you should probably give it a shot. Even if you're like, nah, I don't want to play that. Just maybe you owe it to yourself to give this card a shot. But anyway, let's move on to Blood Spatter Analysis up next. Man, the names in this set. This is just a black and a red for an enchantment. When it ETBs, it deals 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. Whenever 1 or more creatures die, mill a card and put a bloodstain counter on Blood Spatter Analysis. Then sacrifice it if it has 5 or more bloodstain counters on it. When you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Okay, so it's a cheap removal spell that puts a card in your hand. That's just good. Just on a baseline, that's pretty good. It's only 2 mana to bolt a thing. You know, I got on that red case a couple of cards back because it's 3 mana for 3 damage. It only hits creatures. This too only hits creatures, which is kind of lame compared to the other 2 mana instant speed options that we have in standard that hit multiple targets. You know, this ain't no lightning strike in that department, but still, despite the sorcery speed and the lack of broad targets, all I'll say is that even though you got to do a good bit of waiting, I think realistically it's probably going to take many turns in some cases for this to actually go off. But once it does, I think you'll find that you're really, really happy that happened. You know, just like a pretty normal situation with this card is that you play it turn 2 to kill your opponent's 2-drop or something like that. And then later on in the game, you have a Shieldred out and like 4 counters on this thing. So now your opponent's in this hopeless situation where if they kill your Shieldred, if they actually draw the removal spell to kill your Shieldred, guess what? Just going to get her right back. You know, so I could actually see, again, this putting your opponent in some pretty sticky situations at the end of the day where if they end up killing that thing, you're just going to get the best creature in your graveyard back. So they probably shouldn't block or point a removal spell at that guy they would otherwise want to. So I don't know. I actually kind of really like that about this. And it even plays with your own sweepers and stuff fairly well. You know, because if it's on 4 counters and then you cast a burn down the house or some black sweeper or something like that, then suddenly, yeah, you wipe the board, you lost a couple of guys and it feels kind of crappy, but at least you kind of draw a card off of your own sweepers. So there's a lot of really cool stuff about this card. And besides that, I just like it. I really like the design of it. It's simple. It's not like hard to understand while still doing a lot of stuff, creating card advantage while being a removal spell. It's Rakdos. I like Rakdos. So just like a lot of things to like about this card from my perspective. But ultimately, I'll start where I began. A removal spell that puts a card in your hand is just good. Well, let's take a quick look at Fugitive Codebreaker here. 2 mana, 1 and a red for a 2/1 Goblin Rogue with Prowess and Haste. It also has Disguise, 5 and a red, but don't worry. This Disguise cost is reduced by 1 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. When Fugitive Codebreaker is turned face up, discard your hand and then draw 3 cards. I stand corrected about that Disguise guy earlier that we talked about, the blue flying man. Who remembers that guy's name? This dude is probably the best looking Disguise guy that we've seen for standard so far, just because he's actually pretty good stat line just for like the normal cost you're paying. 2 mana, 2 power guy, prowess and haste. Yes, like that's kind of good enough almost by itself. And every now and again, a good part of the card here, it's going to just draw you 3 cards, which is absolutely nuts. It costs a lot of setting up in order to do that. On the one hand, you could argue that you can turn this into Ancestral Recall once you have 5 instants or sorceries in your yard. It only costs 1 to flip over, but no, actually it still costs, it was actually, you played Harmonize. You actually paid 4 mana to draw 3 cards. So that Harmonize is still a fine card. Not anywhere near as good. It's 4 times worse than Ancestral Recall. It's actually many times worse. There's some sort of exponential math that goes on the more mana that you add. But either way, what I'm trying to say here is that Harmonize is nowhere near as good. And you also, I want to point this out, spent turn 3 facing this guy down, which means what did you not do? Play instants and sorceries. So you skipped an entire turn and 3 mana. 3 mana can put 3 instants and sorceries in your yard by itself, right? If you're doing it right. So you skipped a whole turn of being able to do that to face down this guy in the first place. So again, just facing down stuff, cloaking stuff, whatever you want to call it, is slow. It's slow. It's not really what mono red aggro wants to be doing. And there's also the fact, I guess, that if you are playing against mono red and they face down a guy on turn 3, it's this guy. That there's no element of surprise there, like whatsoever, So he's a cool dude, though. Just 2 mana, 2/1 prowess. Again, I will end where I began. I repeat myself too much. 2 mana, 2/1 prowess for 2 mana is a great baseline. Nothing embarrassing about the card. And if the game does go a little bit too long for you, suddenly drawing 3 is a great thing to be able to do. Let's move on to a blue commander card that might actually be just pushed enough for standard. This is Profs Tic Memorypem. PEM is just 2 mana, 1, a blue for a legendary enchantment. And when it ETBs, you draw yourself a card. And also, you have no maximum hand size. It's kind of, if that were the end of the card, I would kind of think it was cool in and of itself. But here's the actual cool part. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've drawn more than 1 card this turn, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn, -1. Okay, so in case you didn't keep that score there, that is 2 mana for the turn it comes into play, you draw a card, and you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, and also you just get Thought Vessel for no reason. You want a Thought Vessel? You want a Library of Ling? Sure, I want a Reliquary Tower. That's pretty sweet whipped cream, and this time it's way more than a dollop. Now, there are numerous commander decks that want this card. Again, we'd be here all day. If I listed all the commanders that want this, I would say it's a solid 100 or so that want to put this card in their deck because they love drawing cards. Who doesn't love drawing cards? You like to draw cards, commander's card goes in your deck if you run islands. There's just almost no getting around that if you have creatures and you like to draw cards. You are playing commanders, so you have at least 1 creature. You want to put 20 +1/+1 counters on your commander the turn he comes into play. Give this a shot, right? Again, depending on who your commander is. Gadwick? I'm trying to think of one that could do that the turn he came into play, but there's actually way more than that, So, I don't know, just if you're playing like Keza, you play play this card, right? But I'm mostly here to talk about standard, where even if you just play this on 2, you play a 1-drop, you play like the Siren from LCI that puts a map token into play. It's a 1/1 flyer for 1 mana. Just any 1-drop. Then you play this on 2 and you draw a card and suddenly you have a 2/2 flyer. And then next turn you play Thirst for anything. Just any of the thirsts available to play in standard, however many there are right now. And suddenly that's 3 extra cards. What do you have, a 5/5 flyer at this point, and you've drawn a bunch of cards? You've used all your mana on every turn and you only have 1 guy out. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but either way, you get the point I'm trying to make. It's not too hard to draw a bunch of cards all at once in standard, even for a relatively low amount of mana. Now, we got 2 more cards to look at before today's video is in the books. One of those cards is easily the most powerful card we've seen today, and possibly the most powerful card we've seen in the set. It's really up there, but this card that we're going to look at now is just my favorite card of the day. Easily my favorite card of the day. And if you know anything about me, the moment you read it, you knew that I would love this card. It's Relive the Past. This is 7 mana, 5, a green and a white for a sorcery. Return up to 1 target artifact card, 1 target land card, and 1 target non-aura enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. They are 5/5 elemental creatures in addition to their other types. Okay, so I think Brilliant Restoration is probably the better card. Did you remember Brilliant Restoration existed? I sure did. I've cast it hundreds of times, and I'll probably cast it another 50 or 60 times before it rotates out. I love that card. And even though this doesn't, return all the cool stuff at the same time, it does do stuff that Brilliant Restoration doesn't do. Of course, it ramps you, so that's something. If you wanted a little bit of ramp, there it is. You're already at 7 mana, but in case you want more, sure, the world is your oyster. As far as the other things, this can still get back up Portal to Phyrexia and a Virtue of Persistence at the same time in case you want to be as evil as a person could possibly be. You can do that. Plus a spread of other stuff and wacky stuff. You know, you get back a Dragon Wing Glider and go ahead and swing in. You get back an Invigorating Hot Spring. Make one of those dudes that you brought back a 6/6, swing in, go ahead. You know, there's ways to finagle this and do fun stuff with it, but that's mostly what it is. It's fun stuff. But like I said earlier, that's why I play Magic. I like fun stuff. I like fun cards, I like neat cards, cool designs, and I like doing stuff I like to do. And this is one of the things that I can tell you right now, I really like to do. But the final card of the day is, as promised, an absolutely ludicrous card. It's Archdruid's Charm. This is 3 green mana for an instant. Choose one. On mode 1, you search your library for a creature or land and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield tapped if it's a land. Otherwise, put it into your hand. Shuffle your library. On mode 2, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. On mode 3, just exile target artifact or enchantment. Yikes! This is actually 6 spells. This is 6 spells that I'm counting in one, right? This is a 3 mana ramp spell. This is a 3 mana creature tutor as well. This is exile target artifact, exile target enchantment. That's 4 spells. Put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, 5 spells. And then bite effect 6. Yeah, 6 spells in one spell. And yeah, you do have to be pretty heavy green to play this. I hope this is a cycle, by the way. Charms are very often cycles. So hopefully we get a cycle of these that are just as powerful looking as this, because if this is the green one, I can only imagine what like the black and blue ones look like. By the way, if it is a cycle, or even if it's not, honestly, I kind of think the flavor is a little bit cheeky, given that usually we get guild stuff in Ravnica. You know, we get like 2 color stuff in Ravnica and they work together and blah. But this is like the most monocolored possible card. And it's in Ravnica, so that's kind of neat. But still, just look at all the stuff it does at instant speed. And like, you know, cards like Goblin Chain Whirler and other like 3 mana of the same color cards. You know, Invoke Despair, I think most recently taught us the lesson that you do not have to be a monocolored deck to resolve spells like this. The card just always does something. And I love that it's an instant speed creature tutor as well, because just end of your opponent's turn, go search something up, slap it down on the next turn after you untap and draw. So, you know, usually 3 mana tutors are kind of bad, but when they come at instant speed, they become way much better, you know? So, man, this card, dude, this card, man, it's instant speed. They just figured that like it being 3 green would just make up for everything. No, it's totally balanced. It costs 3 green. It's balanced. It's fine that it's an instant. This card's fine. We promise you this card's fine. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. I should also, just by the same token, I should bring up that you don't see a whole lot of instant speed ramp either. You know, like, I think a lot of people are going to argue that 3 mana go get one thing and ramp it onto the table is the worst mode on the card, and it probably is, but I still think you'll take it a lot of the time, given that it's instant speed, especially, you know, being able to do this EOT is really sweet. Just out of nowhere, you have a whole more mana on an early turn than your opponent thought you were going to have. They didn't plan for that, and now they're going to have to. So just the fact that that ramp is instant speed is pretty nuts in and of itself. Just everything the card does is good, you know? Oftentimes you see charms, and what they do is weighed in such a way that they don't do a thing that you would normally pay 3 mana for. But considering they do 3 different things, you don't mind paying 3 mana. In this case, the card kind of does a 3 mana thing, no matter which mode you pick, that you're not embarrassed paying 3 mana for. Again, especially at that instant speed. Key to the card, dude. Just like, what a card to print. That's all I'm going to say. I don't think it's like dangerous to print this or anything, but it is an obviously busted Magic card that's like way above the power level of most of, if not all, the cards we've seen from this set so far. But seriously, isn't that card a little bit too much? Hi, it's me recording the outro the same way I did the intro, everybody. That's all the cards so far for today. Just let me know how you felt about everything. There's some really wacky commons and uncommons that I actually can't wait to get my hands on. But again, like I said towards the beginning here, pretty much every rare and mythic today is worth at least talking about. So let's talk about them down there in the comments. How'd you feel about everything? Set is shaping up to be pretty wacky at this point. I'm liking it. There's a lot of powerful cards and all that. So hit me with the opinions down there below in the comments section, and do all the YouTube stuff on your way out. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't done it yet, and make sure you check out the Patreon, just $1 a month to get involved over there, and you can vote on what decks we do and all that. And it just really helps me out, to be very honest with you. Be frank. It just helps me out tremendously, and it lets me keep doing this, and I need patrons. So thank you very much if you are one or are considering being one. But that's all I've got for now. We are about halfway through this set. That's all. We're only about halfway through this set. We've already seen just some goofy, good stuff. So more to come. Just, again, make sure you're subbed because there's going to be more spoilers, not just Monday, but all weekend long. So I'll see you then. Meet you back here tomorrow, guys. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.